The E46 M3 was a car I lusted after for years when I had my little Renault Sport Clio, and when I finally had the chance to buy one, I couldn't afford a CSL, but I wanted the goodies after hearing that airbox. And I've had some absolutely fantastic adventures over the years, including the project build on the channel, and I almost completely rid it off on track. The SMG gearbox is incredibly love and hate across the community, but I love it. But unfortunately, it has some issues. So in today's video, we're going to look at installing the Burkhart Engineering SMG motor pump to hopefully make that gearbox just a little bit more reliable. Now, you can buy this directly from Burkhart, but if you're in the UK like myself, you can also get it from Hack Engineering, who will be able to get it to you faster than coming from Europe. The kit comes with the new motor, temperature sensor and fluid. I'll put all the details in the description of where you can get one. I needed to move the E46 into a suitable position to work on it. Now, with the E92 being sold, I had some space, but the first job was actually to move my little Renault Sport Clio that had been tucked away in the corner of the driveway. Bizarrely, even though this thing is one of the oldest things I own and is French, it's also one of the most reliable. It just seems to work all the time, but today we had a very near miss. Near miss on the driveway, you say? What on earth could I possibly get wrong here? Well, essentially the car fired on the button and I move it from near the window to the top end of the driveway so I can put the E46 in its place to work on it. I notice a small hint of petrol, but this is not unusual because the car's got a decal on it, obviously only when it's off-road. But when I open the door, it stinks and I can see the trail of petrol that's followed the car. And then when I open the bonnet, I'm even more horrified to see it's been spraying all over the engine bay. Thank God it didn't ignite from a spark or even on the exhaust manifold. But my good friend Spence came round, cleaned it up, and then we had a quick look at where the problem was.
Yeah, whoa.
Out that third injector, isn't it?
Yeah.
See it spray out of there. That was too much of a close call for me. Imagine I'd been on a breakfast drive and that had happened. I think the car would have just gone up in flames. So yeah, we're going to do a video on the Clio next time and go through what actually happened. But pleased to report, nothing caught fire. I did have to stand on the driveway and wait for any Deliveroo drivers to come by and not flick a cigarette butt there, because then again that could have also been the end of the fleet. But essentially I got the E46 M3 into position, and in typical British fashion, the heavens opened, which meant no tinkering today on the driveway, but we were in position and ready to go when it dried up. Finally, we've got some good weather in the UK, which allowed for some tinkering on the driveway to begin. Following this guide, I must stress, is at your own risk. I'm not a trained BMW mechanic, and this is my first time doing it. So if you spot any errors on the way, let me know and we'll put it in the comments. The first job is to remove the strut brace. This is simply held on with 4 13mm headed nuts. With that out of the way, put it to one side. We then need to unclip the trunking that holds the cables that run across the engine bay just below the cabin filter, then the clips that go onto the airbox, and then finally the cabin filter cover and the cabin filter itself. It's pretty self-explanatory, so if you're struggling at this stage, this job might not be for you. You'll then need to remove the cabin filter drip tray. I assume that's what it's called. There are essentially 4 Torx screws in there, and once these are undone, you can then pull the rubber seals out of the way and it should all just lift out quite naturally. As I've got the CSL style airbox fitted, it's going to be slightly different if you've got the standard plenum in place. Essentially, the reservoir where the SMG is mounted to on mine is on the strut tower, but on the standard car it's actually built into the airbox. So it will be slightly different, but again, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. At least I hope so anyway. But for me, I just undo the 4 screws and then the front of the airbox and the snorkel assembly can be removed. Pleased to report the air filter looks pretty good. I then just need to unclip the oil breather that goes from the top of the rocker cover to the airbox. With the oil breather pipe put to one side, you can then unplug the air inlet temperature sensor, and then it's onto the clips that hold the throttle bodies to the plenum airbox itself. Now essentially the BMW original clips, I would advise buying the tool that lifts these out. I did it previously years ago with a flathead screwdriver, damaged them all, and then I had to buy these replacement clips, which aren't the genuine BMW one. I believe they're one-time use only, but if I'm honest, I've had them off 2 or 3 times now, and they seem to work again absolutely perfectly. From memory, these are a CV clip, because you can do it with Jubilee clips as well, but they're just a little bit too thick, they look a bit messy. I just prefer this method, even though they're an absolute nightmare to remove in comparison to Jubilee clips. Pleased to report the air filter actually looked pretty good for my 2 years use, even though I don't do that much miles, granted, but the airbox looks absolutely fantastic inside. But then we can see what the underside is secured on by, which is 2 vibration mounts. The one closest to the front bumper is actually relatively easy to remove. You can get a spanner in there and just unloosen it. The problem is the one behind is incredibly tight, and I struggled on for this for a good 10 minutes. But as I found out later, with some long extensions, you can actually get to it from underneath the car, putting an extension right up with a 10mm socket, which is actually the way I put it back together. It's a lot easier, but this will make more sense when we jack the car up. With the glorious Karbonious airbox removed, we can now get our first look at the SMG pump. On a right-hand drive car, on the passenger side, you'll have the DME cover in the engine bay. Now this is held on by a couple of torque screws, and once you remove these, you can simply lift the cover out of the way and it'll expose the DME, which is essentially the ECU for the car, and the relays and a lot of wiring loom. And essentially what we need to remove is the Salmon relay at the front, as this is essentially responsible for powering the SMG pump, and we don't want it to power up anymore while we're working on it. But with that disconnected, we can put it to one side safely, and we go into the car, turn the ignition on to the second position, but don't start the engine, and then we simply select first to reverse. And what we're trying to do is depressurize the system. Eventually the car will stop shifting into gear, and you'll get the SMG cog of doom light appear, which means we're now ready to go. So the only final step is to disconnect the negative from the battery. The SMG reservoir is full of fluid, and as we follow the line down to the SMG pump, you can see there's a small red collar, and essentially you press this and you can pull the pipe out. But what I do is make sure there's some kitchen roll even down there, just to try and catch any fluid, as I definitely don't want it spilling on the driveway. And then once I've pulled it out, put my finger over the end, disconnect the reservoir from the strut tower, take it over to my oil waste bin and let it all drain out and wait for it to be empty. The next job is to remove that airbox bracket that holds those 2 10mm anti-vibration nuts underneath. You undo the SMG pump at the top, there's a 10mm nut there, and there's not really enough room to slide the SMG unit over to get that bracket bolt off. At least I didn't have anything in the toolbox suitable. So what I needed to do was get the car jacked up, and then you'll be able to undo a lower mount for the SMG pump, which I'll show you shortly, which will give you enough room to remove that bracket. Now I've done plenty of videos on jacking the car, but essentially as mine is too low, I have to jack it onto a bit of wood and then pull the jack out, go back round on the front to the central jacking point, jack that up, and once it's at a height I'm ready to work on, we can then put it on axle stands. Never work on a car on a trolley jack, because if the hydraulics fail, you're going to get squashed. We then need to remove the passenger side wheel, which is just a 17mm socket, 5 bolts. Yes, I'm fully aware my discs are very rusty from a lack of use, but once that wheel is out of the way, you can then see we've got the connector for the electrics for the SMG reservoir, and then there's a small 10mm nut to the left of that that we need to undo for the mount. With the 2 10mm nuts removed from the SMG pump, you can then lift it carefully to one side and get to that 13mm nut to finally undo the airbox bracket. I don't know how you'd do it any other way. Again, let me know in the comments if you've got a solution, but as that bolt's got to come out for the SMG pump anyway, didn't really make any odds to me. Now with full access to the hydraulic lines, I first use some XCP just to clean off any grime that's on there and make sure nothing is seized, as I have heard these can be troublesome sometimes. It's then a case of putting a cloth to one side just so you catch any fluid that leaks, And then we need to get a 6-sided socket like I've got here and essentially crack all the lines off. Now, as I mentioned, I've read some horror stories about these being seized. Really pleased to report mine actually came off really nicely. And as you'll see in a few clips, these are color coded to the line that they go into the SMG reservoir. The only problem I had was with the black line on the right hand side. I couldn't actually get the spanner in there comfortably, and I didn't want to risk breaking anything or bending any hydraulic lines. But what I did have in the toolbox was something called a crow's foot. And essentially a crow's foot allows you to get in at an angle. It's a bit more time consuming, but it gets it safely removed. It's still 6-sided, so it's not going to round off the nut that comes off the hydraulic line. Putting my Tetris skills to the test, I managed to wiggle the pump out of position from the engine bay. I then take it over to the drip tub and lean it on the side, and there's probably a good couple of 100 ml of fluid that comes out of the pump. So definitely don't do this as you're pulling it out of the engine bay, because it's going to make a right old mess. But with that removed, you can now see the big hole where the SMG pump lives. Into the comfort of the workshop, we can see the pump assembly on the bench. And I should also mention at this point, you can see how the electrical connector undoes, which is just anti-clockwise. Pretty straightforward, but again, fiddly when you're on the car. The first tool we're going to need is a T20 Torx bit to remove the harness cable. I also removed the secondary harness bracket, which actually turns out I didn't need to with the method I used of cutting and soldering the cables. But again, we're going to discuss this in a little bit because it's probably not the official way that Burkhart want you to do this. With the two brackets out of the way, the next challenge is actually getting the motor out. Now this is a T25 Torx bit, and there are just 2 screws that hold it in place. It's one of those things, once you've got the screws out of the way, you kind of hope it'd just fall out, but it does just need a little wiggling backwards and forwards. But once it's out, you can see why, because there's a seal there. I've got a little bit of corrosion, so it certainly wasn't just going to fall out, but pleased to report, still pretty straightforward. Thankfully, once the motor was out, mine didn't actually look too bad. I had seen some pictures online with a lot of corrosion, obviously potentially where a seal's failed, but everything looked in pretty good order. But I still took it apart, cleaned it out, used some bearing grease where the motor sort of like seats into the new drive, so it was going to be well oiled and hopefully last carefree for many miles. You can now reinstall the new motor, and essentially you use the same screws that came off of the old motor and it goes in exactly the same way. Once it's seated, using that T25 Torx bit, you can then torque them up to 6 Newton meters, and the motor is fitted in the SMG pump. Following this next step in my wonderful guide is completely at your own risk. Now, to remove the cables from the original plug, the pins, Burkhart sell a proper tool for the job. It's about €30. It releases the tab and it saves you damaging it. I foolishly thought I'll probably be able to do this with a screwdriver. The more I looked at it, the more I thought, do you know what? I'm going to mess something up. So I'm going to cheat, and I'm sure there's going to be some frowning eyebrows in the comments. But essentially, I cut the cables to remove the pins, keeping the existing pins in place, and then I solder them together. And the reason is, I didn't want to risk damaging the plug, because if I damage the plug, I can't see it for sale separately anywhere. I'm going to have to buy a whole used assembly. It just wasn't worth the headache, and I certainly wasn't waiting a week or two for the new screwdriver to come from Germany. So, yep, made the decision to heat shrink, solder it. Do at your own risk if you do, but it's certainly a lot easier and it saves you buying that tool. With everything soldered, heat shrinked and taped up, it was looking factory fresh. It was then on to doing the new temperature sensor. Pretty straightforward. There's a small clip that you need to lift, and then you can pull the plug out, and then you can undo the old temperature sensor with a 19mm spanner, put the new one back in and fit the clip back in. The problem is I didn't have a torque setting for this sensor and I couldn't find it anywhere. I would take a wild guess at somewhere between 12 to 15 Newton meters. Again, let me know in the comments if someone has got it. But essentially I give it the old twist pinch like a spark plug in the old days, and it felt pretty good. Ta-da! You now have a complete SMG pump. And last thing you need to do is just make sure there's no dust, grit, etc. where the nuts are going to go in back for those hydraulic lines, because the smallest bit of grit, you're going to get a leak. Back outside, it's just the reverse of the removal, putting it all back together. And as you can see, make sure you've got those hydraulic lines in the correct colours. They are coated on the lines and the pump. Pleased to say that this is all pretty straightforward now. If you've got this far, you're on the home straight. Essentially, the hydraulic lines need to be torqued to 14 Newton meters. And again, using that crow's foot, it helps me get the right hand black line comfortably torqued up. We can then refit the reservoir and then install the Burkhart SMG fluid. Now I believe this is actually uprated. I'm not 100% sure on it, but I'm sure I remember reading somewhere that it's meant to be improved over the BMW stuff. But yeah, let me know in the comments again if you've heard otherwise. Now at this point you need to be careful how much fluid you put in the system. For the first initial bleed, I absolutely brim it. So I put a full bottle in there, but actually over the entire process, I think it uses about 600 millilitres. A quick check to make sure we've got no leaks from the reservoir. We can then refit the airbox into position and the air inlet temperature sensor, refit the Salmon relay, and again another quick check to make sure we've got nothing dripping out from the pump. We can then lower the car back down off the axle stands because it does need to be level for the test. I can't even remember where I bought this kit from. I think it was B cables on eBay as it shows in the listing, but ultimately it's a copy of BMW's INPA, and you're going to need something like this to bleed the system because without it there ain't no way you're getting the air out of the system. But once it's all plugged in and up and running, you can then turn the ignition on and then start the special features program, which is the SMG gearbox bleed. Now essentially it takes about 16 to 20 minutes, and you are going to need to keep the car on a trickle charger. I use a CTEC MSX 5 amp, which provides enough power throughout the process. And as you can see here, whilst it's bleeding, you do get foam in the bottle, and it actually says on the screen, waiting to defoam. And all you need to do throughout this process while it's clunking away is make sure you keep the SMG fluid reservoir topped up, because if it runs low, you're going to pull air in and have to start again. Hopefully at this stage you're greeted by a green screen and the test reports no faults. You've done your job. We haven't completely put the car back together, but essentially we need to close the bonnet as it won't allow the car to engage first gear with it open for the test. I'm pleased to report everything works perfectly. I go forwards in first gear, backwards in reverse, and then I try going forwards in second gear. Everything works just like it should. Wicked, just what we needed after getting this done. Now, in terms of difficulty, I wouldn't say this is the worst job I've done. I would arguably say the gear position sensor is much worse, which I'll link at the end of the video if you want to see more woes of SMG life. But essentially we need to put everything back together on the car again, which is the reverse of what we've done with the removal. Pretty straightforward, but I was starting to lose daylight pretty quickly. Now once everything was back together on the car, I would advise going for a test drive just to make sure absolutely everything is perfect. Now when I first heard about the soft reset, I did think it was snake oil, but what I will say is it definitely seems to pull away better. I don't know whether it's some sort of clutch adaptation that it does. I do it every year when I bring the car out of storage, and essentially in a suitable road condition, you get the car up to 50 miles an hour, put the car or the gear stick into neutral, hold both paddles for 10 seconds, and essentially while you're coasting, counting your head 10 seconds, let go of the paddles, put it back into drive, no beeps, nothing will say it's been done, but as soon as you pull away again, everything just feels a little bit smoother. Again, I've not really dug into this. I've heard a lot of talk about it on the forums and it does work really well. So yeah, hope you really enjoyed the video. If it's helped a few of you out, make sure you hit that like button, consider subscribing. We've got a few more jobs on the e46 M3, but if there's anything in particular you'd like to see on the channel with the M3 within reason, let me know in the comments, because this year I want to use this car some more now the E92 has sadly gone. Until the next one, thanks for watching.